So, einen wunderschönen guten Abend und herzlich willkommen im Naturmuseum. Freut mich ganz besonders, Frau Dr. Sheila Colla zu begrüßen, die ich über Twitter kennengelernt habe. Sie wird uns heute, also wer ist Sheila Colla? Sie ist eine außerordentliche Professorin und Naturschutzforscherin an der York University in Toronto in Kanada. Sie hat 2 Jahrzehnte lang die Ökologie und den Schutzstatus einheimischer Bestäuber in Nordamerika untersucht. Und in diesem Vortrag wird eben der Rückgang von Bestäubern in Nordamerika dargelegt und dargestellt und auch den Zusammenhang mit den Honigbienen eben also wie hängen die Wildbienen und die Honigbienen, wie hängt das miteinander zusammen, was den Rückgang der Arten eben betrifft. Der Vortrag, ausnahmsweise bei uns eher eine Seltenheit, wird in englischer Sprache stattfinden. Sollte es anschließend Fragen geben, können die sich gerne auch in deutscher Sprache stellen. Ich werde versuchen, die dann zu übersetzen. Welcome, good evening. I'm very glad and honored to have Dr. Sheila Colla here at the Museum of Nature in South Tyrol. She's an associate professor and conservation scientist from York University in Toronto, Canada. She has studied ecology and conservation status of native pollinators in North America for almost 2 decades. And in her presentation tonight, she will discuss the status of pollinator declines in North America, as well as the process to assess declining species using museum specimens and the IUCN Red List. She will also discuss sociocultural issues related to pollinator conservation, including the conflation of honeybee livestock management with bee declines. So this is from our website. I hand you over now the word, Sheila. Thank you for coming. Also, thank you all for coming on a short notice. We know we published the conference for tomorrow, but it's tonight, and we stream it also on YouTube, so you may watch it later. If you have any questions in Italian or English or German, just feel free to ask him after the talk. It will last about 40-ish minutes, we said. And Sheila, the stage is yours.
All right, thank you so much. So yes, I'll just be talking a little bit about what it is like to be a conservation scientist, specifically working on insects. There have been many studies recently. Actually, this is an older study that showed that we are losing a lot of insect species, but we don't know very much about our insect species. So we have less than 1.4 million described, and less than 1% of the 1.4 million described insect species have been assessed in terms of their conservation status. So we really don't know how many insects are at risk of extinction, but from the groups that we do know, it seems around 40% are threatened. This is in contrast to vertebrates, where we know the status of many species, and we know that there's actually like a certain number that have gone extinct as well. For insects, there are a lot more questions. So I work on native bees, but the first thing I always need to talk about is, of course, honeybees, because a lot of the media, a lot of the science, a lot of the money does seem to focus on the honeybee industry. When I first started working on bumblebees, it was about 2004. And I was the only person in Canada that was actually studying wild bumblebees at the time, or the decline of wild bees at the time. And then all of a sudden, colony collapse disorder hit in the US, and that was around honeybees and the honeybee industry. So since that time, every year, people seem to be more and more aware about bee declines, but there's been a lot of confusion. And some examples of this confusion are, for example, the European honeybee, which is not native, being the state insect for about, I think it was about 20 of the states. So it's not even a native species, but it represents the state. And there's a lot of examples of sustainability initiatives where people bring in beehives and they think they're being more sustainable, but there's a lot of reasons why that isn't the case, which I'll go into in a second. So these are some titles of papers in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years. This one is our paper that just was published yesterday, looking at the impacts of urban honeybees on wild bees. So it's a little bit complicated because there's hundreds and hundreds of species of wild bees, and some species are more impacted than others. There was also another similar study about a month ago that found the same kind of situation in Montreal, which is kind of comparable to Toronto, where the increase of honeybee hives inside cities has caused declines of wild bees. We also have examples of the honeybee viruses, which are very well studied because they're important for the beekeeping industry. now being transmitted to, do I have it here? So we have RNA viruses spilling over to wild bumblebees, and also even syrphid flies. So they're even passing to different species. And we know from COVID, for example, that when an animal is exposed to a disease that it did not co-evolve with, it can be very devastating for that animal. So we have a couple species that I'll talk about in terms of wild bees that have probably declined because of diseases introduced from managed bees. There's also studies around competition of managed bees with wild bees, and I just found this one. It was published last year at the end of the year, but it's an example of how honeybees brought into a wildflower system disrupt the pollination of a native wildflower. So even though the native bees are still there, adding honeybees disrupts that relationship between the wild pollinators and the native wildflowers. So there's a lot more research now showing that it's not all good and that we need to think about what we're doing a little bit more. And there's a lot of important reasons why we should shift our focus to conserving diverse, abundant communities of native wild bees. There are many studies now that show even in agricultural systems where you have honeybees, a lot of the time the wild bees are doing the pollination. You just don't notice them because they're very tiny. But they tend to increase the quality of the fruit and the amount of fruit that is produced. And we have examples of this from strawberries, blueberries, watermelon, and a few other crops as well. I think almonds as well. So even if you see honeybee hives in an agricultural area, there's a pretty good chance that the wild bees are probably doing a lot of the work and just aren't getting the credit. With climate change, there's another reason why we need to conserve our wild pollinators. Having many species in a system means that system is more resilient. So if we have a spring storm and all the spring bees are knocked out because the flowers bloom and then they turn to ice, but then you still have your other wild bees that will come out in June and July and August. If we just rely on something like the honeybee for pollination, then that's very risky. It's like putting all of your eggs in one basket, because if something like varroa mite comes through or a different virus, then you have no more pollination. So having as many species in the system means that our systems are more resilient. And then, of course, there's this issue of coevolution. So we have many plant species that have co-evolved with native bees, and a honeybee or any other managed pollinator cannot just replace this relationship in a lot of cases. So I work on bumblebees. There's about 250 species in the world, 46 species in North America, although even that is questionable with new genetic data. We're not entirely sure. In terms of global hotspots, Tibetan Plateau, Mongolia, the Pyrenees, and the Alps. So bumblebees like places that are cold, that have a predictable winter, that have a predictable summer as well, with flower-rich habitats. They're eusocial, which means I have a slide coming up next that will explain that. But the important thing to know about bumblebees is that they collect resources throughout the whole growing season and only produce reproductives at the end of the season. So this is very different than, say, two butterflies, that can mate and produce the next generation whenever. Bumblebees need to have that consistent resource input all the way spring, summer, and fall until they wrap up their season. So that makes them a little bit more vulnerable than other insects. So right now, we are in this stage. So we have queen bumblebees going out, and they're looking for a nest. These nests can be underground rodent burrows, like where rabbits live or mice, or they can be in tall grass. Sometimes they're even in tree cavities, not that often, but sometimes. So when the queen finds a suitable nest, she makes a nectar pot and a pollen ball, and she'll go out and forage her nectar and bring it and store it here. And then in her pollen ball, she will lay some eggs, which will then grow into larvae and hatch into worker bees. So the queens are bigger and the worker bees are smaller. So once workers hatch, the queen just stays in the nest and focuses on laying eggs, and the workers come out and do all of the foraging. So you'll see smaller bees come out at that time. And they help build the colony up and keep it clean until the end of the colony cycle. And this depends on the species. Some species finish up early June, some finish up in September. It really varies quite a bit. And then the queen switches and starts making queen eggs and males. They go out and mate. The mated queens sleep and until they emerge in the springtime. So this is very different than honeybees, which store honey to stay, the whole colony stays awake and feeds off of honey for the winter. It's really just the mated queen that carries, the next generation and that survival. So this period here, when she emerges out of hibernation, is on the verge of starvation, and there's not a lot of forage. This is a very vulnerable, critical period for bumblebees. There's a growing economic value of bumblebees. There is, of course, the honeybee industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. But now we also use managed bumblebees, Bombus terrestris here in Europe. They're better for plants that require buzz pollination, like tomatoes. So this is where you have to grab onto the plant and vibrate, and only then the plant releases pollen. So tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, blueberries, all require to be buzzed in order to be pollinated, and honeybees do not know how to do this. Bumblebees are also much better in greenhouses. Actually, honeybees are useless in greenhouses. Honeybees rely on the sun to navigate. They have this waggle dance, they communicate with each other. But bumblebees actually memorize landscapes on the ground. So that means they can forage when it's cloudy, when it's raining, even when it's snowing. But it also means they forage well inside greenhouses when things are covered. If you put honeybees in greenhouses, they just kind of stay at the top and kind of freak out a little bit. These are some examples of native plants that bumblebees have co-evolved with from southern Ontario. They tend to be kind of longer flowers because bumblebees have kind of longer tongues. These ones require buzz pollination. These are blueberries, irises, gentians. You have similar species here as well. So they're very valuable for these plants. There's also a bit of a cultural value. Here in Italy, I think the cultural value towards honeybees maybe is a little bit stronger, but there are also examples about people thinking about bumblebees for medicine plants and cultural reasons. Of course, The Flight of the Bumblebee is a very popular song that gets sent my way pretty often. So I'm part of the IUCN Bumblebee Specialist Group, and we set out to try to assess the status of the native bumblebees. So I helped coordinate the North American section, which was just the US and Canada. And if you're not familiar, the IUCN Red List is it's an organization that is signed on to by multi-nations. It doesn't have any kind of legal provisions, but once an animal is assessed by this red list, sometimes it's a little bit easier to get it protected under the various countries' laws. This is one of their main projects, is this red list of threatened species. And it's mostly, as I said, mostly focused on vertebrates and some plants, but they're now getting into insects and invertebrates a little bit more. And these are the different categories that an animal or a wildlife species can fall into. So something can be deemed extinct in the wild, so maybe only found in zoos, critically endangered, vulnerable, near threatened, least concern, data deficient, which is what a lot of insects fall into, and then not evaluated, so it hasn't been looked at yet. So I helped run the North American status assessments for this. And this is part of my PhD work and my postdoctoral work as well. And whenever you start on a project that no one has done, you run into challenges right away. One of the biggest ones is actually bumblebees are very difficult to identify. People think because they're large and colorful, maybe they're a little bit easier. But here's an example of how they're not. This species, Bombus fernalde, Bombus flavidus, we thought it was a North American species, but with genetic data, we now know it's a whole Arctic species. So it has a massive range. So getting information for its whole range is very difficult. And to identify it, you have to look at structures on the abdomen. You can't look at the color pattern on its backs. Other challenges, there's pretty much no standardized sampling of bumblebees. It's starting now to be a little bit better, but still it's very difficult to compare historical and more recent. There are many specimens in collections, in museum collections. People have been collecting bumblebees and noticing bumblebees for many, many years. So there actually is a lot of specimens in collections, but the data were not captured. They still aren't captured from a lot of places, to put into Excel sheets and to georeference and that kind of thing. The other thing with bumblebees is they live in colonies. So you can go into a field and see 200, but they could just be one colony. So that makes counting them a little bit more more difficult. So yeah, you might find a lot in one area, but it might not be representative of it being very abundant. And as I mentioned, some of them have very large ranges, like literally around the world. These are some of the more easy to identify species from eastern North America. We have this one that has a brown half moon. We have this one that has a black T, and then yellow, orange, orange, yellow. We have this one that is mostly golden yellow and then has some black shoulders, we kind of say, as compared to this one, which is all yellow but has kind of yellow shoulders. So maybe it's not that obvious to you, but as you practice more, it becomes a little bit more obvious, the difference. This one is the common eastern bumblebee, and it just has one yellow stripe. So this one we can tell even from blurry pictures what it is, because there's it's very hard to kind of confuse it with other things. And this is the species I focused on that is listed as endangered. It's called the rusty patch bumblebee because it has a yellow border and a brown patch in the middle. So a little bit tricky to see, especially when the wings are covered, but you can kind of get used to it. But then we have things like this that are very much more difficult. So 2 yellow stripes. All these species just have 2 yellow stripes. And then this one is kind of supposed to be brownish, but yeah, there's a few species that you need to collect specimens to really be sure of what you're identifying, which also makes it a little bit tricky. When we put together our first identification guide for this species, Bombus andersoni, there was only 2 color patterns known from the previous key that was written in 1988. So we wrote this one in 2011. And now we know that there's all of these other color patterns as well for females, and I'm sure there's even more than this now. So the only way to tell this one apart, you can't use color patterns, is the length of the cheek. So not fun. So we have a data set that's called the Bumblebees of North America. It includes data from lots of different museums, some field work, and individuals even. And the contributions come from more than 70 individuals. Leif Richardson manages the database, and it's now more than close to 1 million records, and that's his website there. So we put this together hoping to write the book of Bumblebees of North America, but we were able to use the data set also to assess the conservation statuses. So for a lot of my PhD work, I spent visiting museums, looking at the insect collections, identifying the different species, verifying that they were identified correctly, capturing the different information on the labels. Sometimes the handwriting is very hard to read, and then trying to figure out where it was found and putting GPS points on it, which again is very difficult when you're looking at things from like the 1800s. So this was the data set we used for the IUCN Red List, but also for our field guide that we wrote, Bumblebees of North America. And the red dots are the more recent records, and the orange dots are the more historical ones. And you can see that in the more remote regions of Canada, we don't have a lot of recent records, which meant we weren't able to assess the northern species very well. And you'll also notice that the red dots, which are the more recent ones, also occur where we have the most people, so where we have the biggest cities, which is not surprising, but it means that our data are not perfect. Some other things that we were able to capture, phenology, so when the queens came out, when the workers came out, when the males came out, when the colony wrapped up, because this differs from species to species. We have hundreds and hundreds of food plant records now. Habitat associations, so some of the species are found more in forested areas, some of them in more grassland type habitats, some of them are doing really well in cities, for example. and we were able to put together kind of historical distributions and recent distributions to compare and do some climate niche modeling. So in order to use the IUCN Red List criteria to determine if something is endangered or vulnerable or threatened, we had to put together some different ways of measuring this. So this is what we used, and I can talk more about it if anyone has questions, but we looked at relative abundance. And this was determined to be the index of abundance appropriate to the taxon, which is what the Red List requires. So that means like what proportion of this species was of all the bumblebees collected. So maybe it used to be 15% of all bumblebees, and now it's 1% of all bumblebees in that given area. Persistence, so if it was in a grid cell historically, and that grid cell was sampled again, was it there or was it absent? And then range, which I'll show with some images in a second. So yes, just some notes here about how difficult it is to use IUCN criteria for insects, especially, like I said, insects that occur in colonies. I won't go into detail now, but if anyone wanted to talk about it, it was very challenging. And these kinds of criteria tend to work better for things that are like wolves or things that you can see from helicopters for a variety of reasons. But what we ended up doing was this index, like I said, the index of abundant appropriate to the taxon. So we basically had to argue that this was the best we could do with this group of animals, the bumblebees. And then if they fall into these thresholds, that is how they are listed. So critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable. For quantifying change, this was done by Rich Hatfield from the Xerxes Society, and he had to clean the data and then look at how the ranges changed over time based on our data set. And this is what we came up with. So of the 46 species that were assessed, 5 of them we were unable to assess because they occurred mostly in the north, and we didn't have any good recent data to compare to. 60% of them were actually least concern. So when you read all the newspaper headings, it says all bees are in decline, we're all going to die in 4 years, and all of these sort of alarmist things. But what we found was actually 60% are actually fine, and in some cases they're even increasing. And I'll have some examples of that in a second. But that being said, there are some species that are at risk of extinction, so a little bit more than a quarter of them. These ones might actually be at risk of extinction as well. We just weren't able to assess them. But some of them being critically endangered means that they've declined by over 90%. So that's like a pretty big deal. And there are not that many species that we can just, lose 1 or 2 and there won't be an impact. So that was kind of our main finding. And then I'll just go into sort of the groups and what we found. So all the members of Bombus Sensus strictu were found to be in decline. Including the rusty patch bumblebee that I worked on, and that was critically endangered. Bombus terricola and Bombus occidentalis both came out as vulnerable, and then these 2 also came out as critically endangered. This is a specialist parasite on these species, but this actually remains quite common in Europe and in Asia because its host here, Bombus terrestris, is still common. But in North America, it's critically endangered and hasn't been seen since, I think, 2011. So these species, we think probably a disease came in with managed bees to explain the declines that we've seen. These species share some habits. They come out early in the spring. They're associated with forested woodlands, and they probably use these habitats for foraging and overwintering habitat. And they're quite large, and they have long colony cycles. This is an example of one of them. So the white are the more recent points, and the black are the historical. And for this species, the western bumblebee, which came out as vulnerable, with a relative abundance decline of about 75%, we seem to have lost it from the lower elevations, but we still find it at higher elevations in the Rocky Mountains here, and at higher latitudes as well. The rusty patch bumblebee, this is a species I focused on for my PhD work. A relative abundance decline of 93%, came out as critically endangered. This species is the first species listed as endangered in Canada and the US. The black dots are where it used to be. The white dots are the more recent ones. This one in southern Ontario was, I found it here in 2005 and 2009. And those are the two last sightings for Canada, for the whole country. So this one you can see how something like a disease makes more sense than something like pesticide use, because it's declined from such a large area in a short amount of time, including things like the Appalachian Mountains, where there isn't a lot of habitat loss or pesticide use. So we think it was probably an introduced disease, maybe related to climate change, maybe not. But it's really hard to study something when you only find one in 2005 and one in 2009. So focusing my PhD on that species was not that fulfilling for that reason, because it's very hard to find now. But there are some good populations in Minnesota and Michigan and Illinois, so we are having conversations about reintroducing it back into Canada if we can. And then another group that shows some decline, the members of Thoracobombus. So these ones are longer tongue species. They're more associated with grasslands and agricultural habitats. They might have a more narrow dietary breadth because they have a long tongue. So they might be more specialists on things like clovers and longer tube flowers. They might be less flexible. They come out a bit later. They tend to come out kind of later, early summer, not so much early spring. And they tend to nest above ground, so not underground. So that might make them more susceptible to things like tilling or pesticide use. They also tend to be a little bit more aggressive, say if like they get trampled on by a cow or something. I've had them in the lab, and compared to the other species, they are more agitated, more aggressive, and probably because they nest above ground instead of underground. So they both, two species in this group came out as vulnerable, and then their specialist parasite also came out as critically endangered and hasn't been seen actually in many years. So this is an example of this species. So the black, again, is the historical, and the white is the recent. And you can see that even though the decline was almost 90%, we still find it throughout most of its range. So I can still study this one, and my lab does still study this one. So it's more of a decline in abundance, but we still can find it where we know to look for it. So we're still working on this species. And then this was kind of a surprising one. It's Bombus fraternus. It's called the Southern Plains bumblebee. It really likes low elevation, hot regions, which is kind of unusual for bumblebees, which tend to like colder. But the black dots are the historical, and the white dots are more recent. You can see we just like haven't really seen it very much. But this species is not on any kind of endangered species list. No one is protecting it. No one is working on it, even though the decline has been pretty drastic. So this is kind of one that was a bit surprising. And then I mentioned some species were doing very well. I mentioned the common eastern bumblebee, which has one yellow stripe. In North America, this is the species that's also used in greenhouses, like Bombus terrestris is here. And this species is found everywhere where it was found historically. It's also moving eastward and moving northward, maybe naturally or maybe with greenhouse use and then escaping from greenhouses. It's actually been introduced into British Columbia and Alberta, and now is naturalized and is found in the wild because it's escaped from greenhouse use. So yeah, this is one species, for example. Change in persistence, 160%. It's actually doing a lot better than it was historically. So I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but so just some key lessons, because I know people are starting to think about it more here in Europe to try to assess the different species and their statuses of the wild bees. These projects are very collaborative, so we have to work with museums all over the place, even individual collectors. Some people have their personal collections as well that we try to, especially when you're thinking of places that weren't really well sampled, you need to really pull together a lot of people to get this kind of data. And there has to be a way to constantly be reevaluating the specimens, being able to go and check things. It's very slow work, as you probably know. And with the IUCN criteria, if you're able to argue why you're choosing to do things the way you are, there is some room for uncertainty and room for data that's not perfect. And then, of course, there's also the option of just assessing something as data deficient, which at least puts it on a radar that says science is needed here. We need people to do research on the species and assess whether it's at risk of extinction. Yeah, so even though we still are kind of in early stages, we still have enough papers to start moving forward in terms of management and conservation. And now that they've been assessed at least once, we can start reassessing, and we have a baseline that we can compare to, which is really important. So just a few notes about here, the research that I'm doing here in Italy. I'm here on a sabbatical for 1 year, visiting professor at Ca' Foscari in Venice. So we've been interviewing community members in the Monte Grappa area to try to understand what people know about wild bees versus honeybees, and just trying to understand their relationships with nature and understanding of pollination. We interviewed about 35 people, and so far what we've heard from pretty much every single person is they thought the main threat to bees and to wildlife in general was vineyards, and probably the pesticide use used in vineyards. And but no one really talked about climate change or air pollution, which to me are the things that are like most obvious in the region. So that was kind of interesting. But if you do ask people if they've noticed changes in the weather, you do hear them say things like, oh yeah, there used to be a lot of snow, or there used to be seasons and now there's no seasons. So they do recognize that the climate has changed a lot, but they don't see it as a threat to wildlife. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Almost, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 people were able to mention a different type of bee. I think Ape muratrice, a mason bee, maybe a bumblebee every so often. But most people just knew like honeybees, and talked about wasps, calabrone, things like that. So not a lot of knowledge about the different types of native bees, even though in northern Italy there's probably hundreds of species of wild bees. I don't know the exact number, but I would say at least 300, if not well more than that. What else? And then, yeah, very few people recognize syrphid flies on flowers, which I thought was also interesting because in the montane regions, they're probably very important pollinators. I know in Canada and the tundra and the northern colder areas, flies become really important pollinators for not only wild plants, but also things like strawberries and other crops. So thinking about some future directions after doing some work here, there's a lack of resources to identify wild bees. I don't know if you guys are all aware of that. There's no bumblebees of Italy. That would be a good project for someone to take on. The lab that I'm working at Ca' Foscari uses the bees of the UK, which is similar but not the same. And then we're also hoping to do some pollination studies on some of the wild plants in the area. This is a picture of an area near, well, it's in Asolo, and this is actually one of the sites of a wild plant that we want to study, and it's all taped off because it's all going to become vineyards, and there's no like kind of restrictions or anything, even though it's this really old grassland habitat that has this plant that's only found. It's not like an at-risk plant, but it's only found in these certain types of grassland, so it's just kind of one of these things that trying to like put these connections together, like this plant is an important medicine plant, and you know, wild pollinators are evolved to pollinate it, and vineyards are thought to be a top threat by the local people, and here we have an example of a vineyard coming into the site with these plants. So another next step would maybe be to see if we can work with vineyard managers, land managers, to see if they can have more biodiversity on their spaces, just like we do with other, you know, agricultural farms. And this is some research that I'm doing in Ontario. I have a PhD student working in vineyards, making them more friendly to wild bees as well. So those are just some things that we're thinking about. And with that, these are just some examples of all the data providers. There's many, many more, and I'll take any questions.